The question of what defines education is controversial, as we've seen in this course. But in spite of the variety of different underlying theories, there's at least one consistent variable, and that is that education is concerned on some level with the development of the human capacity to think. And in recent years, there's been a lot of discussion about the importance of critical thinking as a primary output of a successful education. Some educators bemoan the lack of critical thinking among students. Others say, as we teach to the test, this comes at the expense of critical thinking. Others talk about rote memorization, creating students that are unable to think critically. And in parallel to all of this discussion, there has emerged a variety of programs or curriculum proposals or assessment tools that are geared towards critical thinking. Many of them claim to create good citizens or to talk about the importance of critical thinking for economic success. Others say no, critical thinking doesn't actually create good citizens or economic success. But what comes out of this is that there's really little conceptual clarity in terms of what the term actually means. Is it a disposition? Is it individualist? Is it cross-cultural? Is this a Western convention? What is meant by this term? And so I begin with the assumption that the formal process of education should be concerned on some level with the development of the human capacity to think. And from that starting point, I'm exploring how cultural contexts influence the way that critical thinking is conceptually understood and practically taught. And the purpose of this research project is to create a case study of critical thinking in a Lebanese school consortium in order to establish a model that can be used to compare with how critical thinking is conceptualized and implemented and assessed in other contexts. Now, some of the background to this is it starts with my own personal experience of living and teaching cross-culturally. When I moved overseas, I began to understand how my own culture affected my own patterns of thinking. As I began to teach with students who are different than myself, I encountered Lebanese students who were either uninterested or ill-equipped to think critically. And this raised the question in my mind of what do I actually mean by this term critical thinking, and what does it mean to encourage critical thinking? Now, some of the theoretical background that I adopt in addressing this question is I start with a realist approach to knowledge, which is the idea that there's ways of thinking that are shared across cultures, that it is possible to make evaluative statements or judgment statements that transcend a specific context, and that discourse on critical thinking actually has as its goal a more accurate understanding of how humans in different cultures can develop the capacity to think in a particular way. Now, I also adopt with this an interpretivist view of social context, which means I understand there's a multitude of rational discourses that exist, and that actors in different contexts create their own sets of meanings and rules and norms that make sense of their social world. And that critical thinking is concerned with which beliefs are justified, but that how a culture defines what constitutes a good reason or what justifies belief actually varies. And this means that there can be a variety of interpretive frameworks that seek to make good sense of the world, but are based on different sets of assumptions, so don't agree with one another. Chan and Yan present a Venn diagram that I think captures kind of my approach to things. And this here, as you can see, has the three overlapping circles. The one category is meant to represent universal reasoning patterns across cultures. And if you don't like the term universal, you could simply substitute shared reasoning patterns that are shared across cultures. Two represents patterns that are shared by some but not all cultures. And then three talks about patterns that are unique to a single culture. So this is how I conceptualize a bit of my approach, theoretical approach to critical thinking. Now, my research question, again, as I mentioned, is how the social, cultural, and religious context in Lebanon affect the conceptualization or influence the implementation of the teaching of critical thinking. And I'm looking at questions such as, what are the assumptions that are related to the role and purpose of education, and how is critical thinking tied to those? How does the religious context influence or shape the definition? I'm going to talk about the social orientation hypothesis and the research synthesis. So where do students fall on this continuum? And then how does critical thinking translate from classroom to daily decision making? Now, I began my research synthesis by looking at different conceptualizations of critical thinking. As I mentioned before, there's not a lot of agreement on these things. One approach to critical thinking is looking at it as a particular set of skills. And by that, this is the skill of weighing evidence or reasoning properly or identifying fallacious arguments. Others argue that critical thinking is specifically related to informal or formal logic. And what that means, it's the ability to deconstruct or construct claims that are consistent with syllogistic rules of logic. So you trace inferences to assumptions, and then you evaluate those assumptions as good or bad using syllogistic Aristotelian logic. And that the goal is to overcome kind of an egocentric or a sociocentric thinking. Others focus on critical thinking as a disposition of reflection, asking probing questions. It's an orientation. It's an attitude. Some focus on critical thinking as a moral perspective, so a set of values that guide our approach to knowledge, values such as humility or tolerance. Others argue that critical thinking is not actually some sort of generic skill, but that it is related to particular discipline, that each discipline has its own epistemological structure, has its own set of beliefs or presuppositions, and to critically think, you need to understand the epistemological structure of a particular discipline and then think within that discipline. And finally, there's thinkers who emphasize that critical thinking cannot just be seen as something that's theoretical, but needs to translate into practice. So it doesn't only focus on the process of reasoning, but it also needs to address the product of that reasoning. Now, looking at these different definitions, I create an operational definition of critical thinking that includes the skill of identifying epistemological foundations in both the deconstruction and construction of justified belief. So rationales used for solving problems, moral perspectives that guide justified belief in different internal logics and different disciplines. The ability to construct and deconstruct claims that are consistent with presuppositions, epistemological presuppositions. Includes a disposition of reflection and humility, and thinking that is not simply abstract or theoretical, but that influences, that it actually translates to praxis and practical choice. So this is the operational definition that I've adopted. Now, a second thing that I've looked at is the educational context in Lebanon. In Lebanon, culturally, your religious identity is a public identity. It's what you're born with. It's not what you believe. So you're Muslim or Christian or Maronite or Druze, depending on who your father is. There's political instability, which means there is not much political infrastructure, or the government does not provide services. So this it strengthens a collectivist culture and ethno-religious identity. Schools are privatized, so 74% of kids enrolled in schools are enrolled in private schools that are overseen by religious entities primarily. It uses a high-stakes test educational model. There's a lack of economic opportunities, a remittance culture, and education seen as an economic way out. So what this leads to is religious influence or control over educational policy. The use of Western curriculums. The actual high-stakes tests are offered in English or French. Knowledge is instrumental. It's a way out. It's a tool towards economic prosperity. Pedagogically, this leads to teaching to the test, knowledge reproduction instead of knowledge engagement or creation, and a passive learning environment. Some of the research on the educational scene in Lebanon talks about how individuals don't converse about non-discussable issues because of fear of conflict. Freiha writes about how religious pressures and lack of accountability characterized the setting. Freha was the former head of the Educational Center for Research and Development in Lebanon, and he talks about that religious groups elevate sectarian interests above the public good. This affects sound curriculum and educational practice. Herrera comes and talks about pain and shame culture, and how when you have a pain and shame culture, you're shamed if you have a wrong answer. This works against critical thinking, which is exploratory. And then there's an interesting article where Simpson and Courtney talk about how critical thinking was taught to Middle Eastern nurses. But what's interesting about this article is that the way that the nurses describe what critical thinking is actually simply participatory learning styles. It has nothing to do with some of the underlying theory of critical thinking. Now, the third area of my research synthesis is looking at the relationship of culture and thinking. And I look at neurocultural mapping and source analysis. So this is how culture is related to physiology. And neurocultural mapping looks at what areas of the brain were active in thinking. So for example, one study looked at people from a Western culture, people from an Asian culture, gave them the same problems, then mapped how their brains functioned in addressing the problem. And they found that different areas were activated from those in a Western culture as opposed to those in an Eastern culture. Source analysis evaluates whether or not genetic differences influence behaviors. And then I focus on Richard Nisbet wrote a book called The Geography of Thought, where he argued that East Asians think holistically and use dialectical reasoning, which is trying to synthesize opposing ideas, where Westerners are analytic and they look at objects and use formal logic to understand behavior. In contrast to thinkers who talk about genetic differences or cultural traits as the primary influence of thinking. Now, this led to the social orientation hypothesis, where basically there's a proposed correlation between independent cultures and analytic thinking and interdependent cultures and holistic thinking. Now, what this leads to, basically, is that if social and ecological and cultural differences affect the way we think, then it needs to affect the way that we approach critical thinking or understand critical thinking. Because if we use or adopt a Western conception in terms of formal logic and analytic thinking, this leads to the perception that non-Western or interdependent cultures do not actually engage in critical thinking. Now, some questions about the social orientation hypothesis are whether or not what's going on here is epistemological understanding or linguistic capital, whether or not this breaks down on the individual level. Varnum shows that this broadly seems to be the case, but when you look at it individualistically, that there are interdependent thinkers in individualistic cultures and individualistic thinkers in interdependent cultures. Davies argues that critical reasoning, Western critical reasoning, is not well understood or well deployed by Asians, so this is what needs to be taught. It's not so much critical thinking as Western reasoning. And then Chan and Yan argue for a distinction between adaptive and critical rationalities instead of the logical dialectical hypothesis. Now, future research direction, there's a lot of ways to go from here. There's the developing of contextual methods for evaluating critical thinking. There's looking at how critical thinking correlates with academic achievement, the relationship between faith and critical thinking, faith traditions, curriculum development, all of these things, and looking at similarities and differences in the understanding of critical thinking across cultures and across different educational cultural milieus. So that is the general direction where this can take me. That was kind of a quick run through, but that basically is what I'm looking at in this